Welcome to Conversations with Writers. I'm Andy. I'm a writer and a writing instructor in higher education. And this is an educational YouTube series meant to catalog writing strategies and philosophies through conversation with other writers. Christopher Murphy earned his MFA from the University of Arkansas and is an associate professor of English at Northeastern State University, where he teaches creative writing. He also reads for Nimrod International Journal. Murphy's work has appeared in Gulf Coast Online, This Land, Jellyfish Review, Necessary Fiction, and Decomp, among others. His debut flash fiction collection, Burning All the Time, is forthcoming from Mongrel Empire Press. And this is my conversation with Chris. Hi, how are you?
Hey, Andy, how you doing?
I'm hanging in there. We know what you're working on. You're working on this amazing new project, a collection of short fiction pieces, right? And that's going to be published soon. So tell me everything. I want to know everything about it. What's the title? What's it about? What's it motivated by?
Yeah. No, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm super thrilled. And as you know, with Tiny Horses, you've been through this process yourself, and it's my first time going through it. So it is it's a long time dream, right? Having a book out, and I am in, knock on wood, like the last stages of it. Every last stage seems to then be followed by another last stage, but I think I'm at the end. So it's called Burning All the Time. I actually just got my advanced copy so that I could kind of read through it and make sure on the page everything looks good. But it's coming out from Mongrel Empire Press, which is run by Jeanetta, the former poet laureate of Oklahoma. It's an Oklahoma-based press, and focuses on Oklahoma-centric work. And the collection is flash fiction. It's 23 stories of flash fiction, all set in northeastern Oklahoma, and really varied in style. Some of them are like straight realism. Some of them are much more speculative. There's like a coded werewolf story in there. There's like some like semi-post-apocalyptic stuff in there, or pre-apocalyptic, cusp of apocalyptic stuff. There's dystopian stuff. But what binds all of the pieces is that I wanted to talk about this region, which has had some wonderful treatment in literature. Real Askew has written about it. Joy Harjo's written about it. Robert Conley's written about it. And I kind of wanted to join that tradition, even though I'm not from here, and to really capture the voices and the lives that are here in these kind of little, I wouldn't call them vignettes, but these very brief kind of condensed stories. And so the project is kind of unified by place. And it came about like real happenstance. I was working on a novel, and I read one of the pieces that's in here that actually leads off the thing, and Jeanetta was in the audience when I read it, and she started crying. She was like, "That was really good." And I was like, "Jeanetta, don't cry, but thank you." And at the encouraging of friends and others who were like, you should holler at Jeanetta about a book. And I finally hollered at Jeanetta about a book, and she said, "Yeah, let's do this." And I realized that I'd been here long enough. I really think you've got to live in a place for a while before you can capture it as anything but a stranger. And I feel like I'd lived here just long enough to kind of barely capture it as a lived experience. And I say this with like the bottomless terror that this thing is going to get out in the world, and a bunch of folks around here are going to read it and be like, "Wow, did you misrepresent this place?" Like it's a real fear of mine. But I feel like I've been here long enough and listened enough and kind of paid attention enough that I could capture some aspects of it. And I had already written a bunch of stories focused on the area, and so I started just collecting them and shaping them, and lo and behold, I got a tiny little book on my hands.
That's wonderful. And again, congratulations on this. It's amazing, and absolutely trust yourself on this. You know the region, you've been there long enough. I think most writers are pretty aware of how they're treating the material that they're creating and the responsibility that they have. And so I think I kind of want to move into that question now, is what role or responsibility do you think writing has? What keeps you generating material? Why write?
Yeah. And I think there's a couple parts to that. And one is the responsibility, and then the one is the what keeps you generating and why write. And and out of some of these answers, might be a little bit dour, or I don't know, they might be a little bit joy killish, but in some ways I feel like, for me, that writing is a compulsion. I have for so long, for so many decades, bound my identity and my way of kind of moving throughout the world with this notion of being a writer, and even more so with the notion of writing. I think a lot of times we get tangled up in like, oh, what makes a writer, and am I a writer? And I think that can be detrimental, and rather it's more about the process and practice of writing and of engaging with the world as a writer. And I've gotten to the point where if I don't write for a while, I get really cranky, and I constantly thinking about projects and constantly thinking about what I might like to do. I take drives and I notice things and I go, oh, can I use that? Or, oh, I overhear someone in Reesers in the grocery store, and I'm like, oh man, I want to put that in my pocket, right? And I'll hang out with other writers, and they'll say something, I'll be like, ooh, no, but you can't use that. Like, okay, I won't use that. But I think why write it's less a question for me of why write and more, can I not? And so far through my life, ever since at the very least my early 20s, so well over 2 decades, I find that I cannot not write, that something continually draws me to the page. And there are costs to that. I think there, in terms of being a writer, to a certain degree, you are separated from the world because you are observing all the time, and that does kind of put you at a remove. And that there can be a cost to connection there. As a discipline, it's incredibly lonely. You got to spend a lot of hours by yourself in an office, and oftentimes you have to exempt yourself. I'll be doing something, I'll be like, adios. I got to go sit by myself and do something for a while. And that is, I think when younger folks think about writing, they think about this kind of like, not Hollywood, but this conception of writing that is more romanticized and less about the practice of it, and to a certain degree the cost. And if you are in it long enough, I think it becomes very difficult to separate yourself from it. So now I'm like, I understand the cost. Why write? Because I have to, and because I really can't conceive of myself any other way. And then what responsibility? This is another thing that I've increasingly tried to hash out in my brain, and it's still a little bit muddy, but I increasingly believe that there is a moral imperative to think about your writing, at the very least, to think about what narratives you're putting into the world. That the narratives we put out in the world shape things, and however obscure, kind of diffuse ways, they shape things. The ways that we view the world are shaped by our understandings of narrative and the narratives we consume. And you have to really think about what sort of narratives you're putting out there, and how they'll be received, and how they will shape people's perception of the world. I like, one of the most immediate examples is I've had folks, students and such, that write stories that deal with suicide. And I'm like, you have to be incredibly careful writing about this. You cannot use it as a plot contrivance. You cannot use it as a means of closing a story off. If you are going to write about this, to a certain degree, the whole story has to be about it. And you have to understand that by putting it out into the world, it has ramifications. And so you have to think about whether you are capable of, and whether you really should put the story out there in the first place. I just watched for the first time Gone with the Wind. It's like way late, but just watched it like 2 days ago. And I'm watching it and I'm like, man, this story is just exceptional. Like, it is so epic and moving, but the underpinnings of it, at the very least, involve a lot of things that I deeply disagree with, in terms of notions of our past and notions of the narratives of that past and how we view the past, that I find to be very dangerous. And so I think that is our responsibility. That doesn't mean that I don't like stories like grindhousey, like murder stories or whatever. I do enjoy those, but you got to think about what you're writing and what you're putting out into the world, and you got to make sure you're, at the very least, cognizant of what you're producing.
Absolutely. And so, what did you learn about yourself through writing, or even this collection that you're now releasing?
Broadly, what I've learned about myself in writing, some of it is like the practice of writing. I've learned about discipline. I've learned about, patience. I've learned about problem solving. Like, so much of writing, especially fiction writing, I feel like, is problem solving. You just hit like a wall and you're like, okay, how do I write my way through this? How do I get the character through this? What's the character going to do next? And you're problem solving. I think some of the things I've learned about myself involve like writing about myself you know, like writing personal narratives, nonfiction, you have to view yourself objectively. You have to view yourself at a distance and go, okay, why did I do this? Who was I in this moment? And how did others perceive me? You know, and you try to kind of like investigate your own narrative. What did I learn about myself with this collection? I think it's just amazing how much there's a process of continually not knowing, right? This is like one of the oldest ideas that we've got in terms of like the more you learn, the less you know, or you realize how little you do know. And there were times when I was writing this piece and then I would have to, or I was writing some of the pieces in there and then editing them and going, wait, is that fact right? Wait, did they play in this division? Wait, was that a brown trout or a brown bass? Wait, was it, you know, like, in this kind of constant process of going, okay, here's the conception of the work, but then here's the details and the sentences that make up that work. Do these things align? Do I have a real understanding of them all the way through? And it changed my practices a little bit because it made me, I think, a more holistic writer. A lot of times I deal with more conceptions. I'm like, oh, this is a fun conception. Whereas this really forced me to focus on things on a very individual level. And I, at the very least, learned that I could do that. And I think I also learned that I have to do that to make really good work, or work that I feel proud of going out into the world.
So if you're struggling to write for whatever reason, it could be time, not enough ideas, too many ideas, whatever it is, what sort of strategies do you use to get yourself to the page?
I mean, I feel like first, what needs to be put out there, we need to constantly put out there, is that writer's block is real and it sucks. You know, like it's like, I did this, I talked with the Muskogee Public Library a little while ago. And one of the folks that was kind of asking me questions was like, oh, we had another writer in here, and they said that writer's block doesn't exist. And I was like, what? Like, okay, like if that's really true for you, writer, then I envy you deeply, but I also think you're lying, because I think it exists for everybody. And then how to get to the page, you know, some of it I think depends upon the sort of project. So like if I'm writing like a novel or something like that, and I get jammed up in a particular moment, oftentimes I'll switch to doing some background work. I'll do some research. I'll do some character work, you know, character building off the page to better know the characters. I'll do setting work or world work. You know, like one thing that I've done where I'll be writing about a character in space and I'll get a little confused and a little jammed up and then realize that I don't have a proper conception of that space. And so like I'll draw like a schematic, like a diagram of like an architectural diagram of their room, so I understand where they are in space, and that can help clarify how they move through it. A lot of times with longer works too, if I get jammed up, the issue is not where I'm jammed, but it's X number of pages before. You know, there's some cleavage in the road, and that cleavage is where the problem is, not where I ultimately got stuck. With smaller pieces, oftentimes, and I think that this may be similar, you could say like this may be a similar approach to poetry with flash fiction, where I'm just trying to bang the first draft out as fast as I possibly can, like sit in inspiration and just not think and feel the future with my face and just get the thing out there. And then later do the kind of slow work of editing, which I know we'll talk about in a second. And I think sometimes, and this happened to me, was it 2 summers ago? 2 or 3 summers ago. I went through about like 5 weeks. It was the worst block I've ever had. Like 5 weeks of just raw jam. You know, like nothing felt good. Nothing was coming to me. I couldn't find inspiration off the page. I was taking walks. I was taking drives. I was reading old works that oftentimes light fires under me. I was reading new stuff to hope to find fresh voices or approaches. I was doing all the tricks that I had that had worked in the past. And none of them worked. And to a certain degree, and if you do this long enough, I think it will be there. But to a certain degree, it was like, I've just got to sit at the page and just bang my head against it. And even though it feels miserable, and I've got to return to it the next night or another couple of nights and do it again and just have faith that things will come. And they do. But I think it takes a lot of faith and a lot of pain to kind of like sit there and do that. And I find in those moments that I'm always a bad judge of my own work. I think most of us are pretty bad judges of our own work in terms of like what is good and what's bad. You know, usually for me, it's like real binary and it's a lie. You know, I either write something and I'm like, I am a golden god and this is the greatest thing that's ever been written. And then I look at it later, I'm like, yeah, this is okay. It's not great. Or I write it and I'm like, this is raw trash. This is garbage and I am a garbage writer and I can't believe I spend my time doing this. And then I look at it a little later, I'm like, oh, okay, this is actually all that bad. you know? And when I was blocked in writing just these little snippets, and I was like, these are all terrible. And I used some of those snippets later to build stories that I really loved. I was not a proper judge of my own work because my mindset was so dark because I was having such difficulty. And some of it was just perseverance and getting through it, and then being able to return to that stuff later and view it from a more reasonable light.
I struggle myself, and on occasion, usually that's a sign of a growth spurt, or what I call the growth spurt, which means there's something in my work that's about to change because there's something in me that's changed, right? And so now my writing has to adapt to this, and I have to figure it out all over again. So it's like starting from scratch all over again. You're a totally new writer, you're a totally new person, and you have to navigate these things together. So what revision strategies do you use? Do you find most useful for revising your works, and what sort of problems do these activities help you solve?
Yeah, so, well, I talk about revision strategy. I want to step back real quick because I also want to say something to put this out there in case, when you publish this, because I've heard this from so many people. This past year in particular has been brutal for writing for like a huge percentage of writers I know. Like everyone was like, there's so much going on and we should have all this time, but there's so much free floating anxiety and there's so much uncertainty about the world. And I'm constantly doing risk assessment. I'm constantly trying to figure out how to operate within the world safely. And I'm worried about my family. There was so much upheaval. And I think to a certain degree, so many of us felt the need to address it, but recognized that we couldn't address it adequately in the moment. And it stymied us. I mean, I can literally count on one hand the amount of my friends or peers or even people that I've read who have like, yeah, this is a productive year for me, or a year plus at this point, 16 months. For so many folks I know, this was a tremendously difficult time to write. And I think I think you're absolutely right, because so many of us were going through this kind of like this process of change as we reoriented our understanding of the world, that the ability to write about it, or even just the ability to write in general, will come a little bit later. I mean, I know I had a friend who was an editor, and she was on a panel and talking about what she is looking for. And this panel was in the fall. And she was like, I can tell you what I'm not looking for right now is pandemic stuff. Because one, nobody wants to read it because we're living it. And two, nobody has had enough time to really grapple with it to write about it cogently. And I think these two concurrent drives of I can't write about it and I feel I must write about it really jammed us up, a lot of us up, certainly jammed me up. Okay, revision strategies. This is one of these, I feel like revision strategies, it's one of these things where, like so much of what we do, the answers are so common as to be boring, and yet they're still true, and I think, I can't remember which of the two previous interviews of yours talked about this, but I agreed with them wholeheartedly that, a lot of it is like being able to put it away for a minute and like come at it later. How long can you put this thing away? Put it away. Stop. You got your draft done. Awesome. Congratulations. Stretch your arms. Feel great about it. Now put that thing away. Unless you have an immediate path to revision, you're like, oh, I need to address X. In which case, you just immediately address X. If that path is open to you, take it. If it is not open to you, put that thing away. Because I think so many of the strategies of revision are just kind of tricking our eyes or our brain to look at the thing differently, to see what we didn't see before, because we become blind to what's there, because we have a conception of it, or we think it's fully realized and it's not. So, I mean, I know this is an old chestnut, right? But like reading it out loud is just, I've entire books, like manuscripts, hundreds of pages. I've read the whole things out loud because it really helps. It really helps you see the thing fresh. I think being open to restructuring and sometimes just saving a different draft. And so you liberated yourself from the fear of making changes and then going, okay, can this go better here? Can this go better there? Can I take this whole chapter and move it earlier? Do I need to have it at all? Are there parts that I can move in other places and cut these parts out? I think those are, these are the old kind of tried and true methods. Having someone else look at it and then discussing with them. One that I really liked, and it works for any size piece. But I had a friend, I was writing a nonfiction piece, and I sent it to her, and it was too long. I knew it was too long. I had to cut it down because the journal that was interested in it said it had to be only so long. And I sent it to her, and she was like, it's a little bit shaggy. And I'm like, okay. And she was like, here's what I want you to do. One sentence. what is this about? And of course, that's a brutally difficult question. You know, I know this, I think this might be apocryphal, but there's like Joyce's kind of quote about like when the interviewer was like, oh, so can you tell us what Ulysses is about? And he's like, if I could tell you what it's about, I wouldn't have written the damn book. You know, you got to read the thing to know what it's about. But her asking me that really kind of clarified what I was trying to do with the piece, and then immediately clarified the parts that I loved, you know, the darlings that I loved but weren't necessary and that I had to cut out, which in this case was my father. You know, so like he read it. I was talking to him about the piece, and he was like, and I was like, yeah, so I had to cut you out. And he was like, you cut me out? And I'm like, yeah, this part of my life. And I was like, I cut you out of the story. And he was like, you cut me. He's like, you're, you know, he used a good Northeastern expletive that I won't say in the in this recording. But I was like, sorry, Dad, you had to go, you know, for this to work. And then that was only possible because my friend really helped clarify by reading the piece and then saying, what do you think this thing is about? And then we talked about, when I came up with an answer, we talked about how to get it there. And that really helped.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've all been part of those awkward conversations with people that we know. If they end up in our work, it just happens.
Yeah.
And the attachment issue I thought was really interesting too. And it reminded me of an activity that I do with my students, because I noticed that they do have a lot of difficulty sometimes in revision. They get attached to things and they don't want to make specific changes, even though it's gonna, you know, sometimes we gotta kill our babies, you know, that old line. So what I have them do is have them write something down that they feel pretty good about, they've been working on for a while, and then I'll ask them to pull it out of their notebook and wad it up, and I go around the classroom with a trash can and I say, put it in the trash can, rewrite what you've just written. And usually what they find is they've written it more clearly and concisely that second time around.
Yeah, it's remarkable how many times that I've heard this story, and a few times it's done myself, where you have a file and you lose it, and then you've got to rewrite the thing, and then you find that file later, and the new version is better. It's a clarified version of the previous one. But the things that you loved or that you found most compelling remain.
Exactly. So what part of the writing process do you enjoy the most, and why?
I think I'm going to give kind of a bull answer about this, right? Because it's really piece dependent. You know, that there are pieces where the conception of it is the thing that I love the most. When I have that initial flash of inspiration or this idea, the premise, whatever, and I'm like, oh, I love it. Oh, this is new. This is interesting. Oh, I can't wait to get to work on this. You know, and that ultimately is the part of that piece that I love the most, is the flash. There are times when I have that flash, but it's actually the translation of like that flash internally going to the material world, taking shape in words, that I love the most, because it becomes actual. I'm like, oh, here is this thing that it was a hazy idea that I thought I liked, but now that it's before me and it has become something of the world, I love it that much more. You know, and that is the part that I love, is the translation. Sometimes it's the editing, where there's a piece that I love, but it's not there, and I know it's not there. And there's a moment in the editing when things kind of click, and they condense, and I'm like, there it is. That's the piece. That's what I was trying to do with it. And I love that, you know, that moment when it's almost like an audible or like a palpable kind of moment when things kind of hit their place. And then there are some times when what I love the most is getting it out into the world. You know, when I've had the kind of rare opportunities to get my work out into the world, you know, I'm not widely published, right? I wish I'd been published more, as most of us do. But there are times when I've put pieces out there, and the response to them, when I've been, those rare moments when I've been lucky enough to have a response, and the piece touched people, or they felt it was necessary, or it spoke to them, whatever. And that's what I love, because one, as writers, I think we all want our work to be out into the world and for people to respond to it. But two, that I'd spoken to people and I'd made them feel something, and that felt really, really good. And a lot of times that favorite moment for one piece is different than a favorite moment for another piece.
And I know you've already touched on this a little bit earlier when you were talking about responsibility of writing and going through the process of writing, but what reading suggestions do you have? What authors do you keep in your back pocket?
Yeah, there are certain authors that I return to again and again, and certain pieces that I return to again and again. You know, I'm so lucky, like so lucky to be able to teach this stuff, right? You know, teach craft and teach writing and like that. I consider it an operation of luck more so than merit, and so I am constantly glad at that luck, and so I get to like return to a lot of these pieces because it's part of my job. So like there's a class that I teach that is the short story, which I just try to do like what I consider the canonical work, and then or the canonical writers, and then later on I'll teach against the canon, or I'll show how the canon is restricted, whatever, because the canon is a dicey proposition. But a lot of those canonical writers I love to return to. So like Chekhov for character, Alice Munro for structure, Donald Barthelme for just his ambition and like his kind of vision. I read Kelly Link. She is among, if not my favorite, living writers, just for her imagination, her ability to kind of take premise and to manifest it in really fascinating ways. I go to John Cheever for sentence. You know, like his exquisite way of framing a thing, oftentimes with such wonderful humor. So many of these folks, like a through line is that they're really funny. And then in terms of more kind of current stuff, I keep a seasonal list of everything that I've read, partially because I got a lousy memory, and partially because I like to pat myself on the back, you know, for being like, oh, you're doing what you should be doing. You're reading, you know, so I keep a list. And like recently that list, like I read Edward P. Jones's Lost in the City. It's a collection, I think, from the 80s, Washington writer, and he is as close to Chekhov, that's not Chekhov, as I've ever read. And so reading him was just a delight, because it was like Chekhov had transposed himself to the predominantly African-American Washington, D.C. in the 80s and wrote those lives. And it was just exquisite. I also increasingly over the past 5 to 10 years have just read more and more and more poetry and have loved poetry more and more. That is something that the more you kind of read it, I feel like the more your joy and your understanding and your connection to it grows. And somewhat recently I read Layli Long Soldier's Whereas, and I thought that was just an exceptional work. I've got in my bag, and then my next thing that I'm going to read is Natalie Diaz's Postcolonial Love Poem, or Love Songs, Postcolonial Love something. And I'm really looking forward to that. She had a piece, They Don't Love You Like I Love You, that references the Yeah Yeah Yeahs maps, which is a song that I love, and I find the poem exquisite. And so I was like, man, if they're all like this, I'm in for a treat. And so I think there are some kind of the classic folks that I return to that continually kind of feed me. And then there's that joy of finding new folks like Jones, or I'm hoping like Diaz, or like Long Soldier, where you find a new person to love and kind of take sustenance from.
Thank you so much for the reading suggestions and making time to hang out with me. I've learned so much. I've had a blast. Thank you again for agreeing to do this.
Andy, thank you so much for asking me. For one thing, it's just great to talk with you. To have a conversation across the country, and I'm honored to take part in this.